Thanks, Alma. Okay, I think we're ready to get started with our first little technical hiccup. Welcome, everybody. My name is Martha Stegman. I'm a professor at York in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And along with my colleagues, Letitia Amaduawu, who's the Executive Director at Seed Change, and Beatrice Oliver, who's the Director of International Programs at Seed Change, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's event, which is a webinar called Indigenous Perspectives on Seed Sovereignty. So I'm sure you're as excited as I am to hear from our panelists today. Kahehtoktha Janice Brant, who's from the Kenhte Seed Sanctuary and Learning Sanctuary, Dr. Priscilla Settee from the University of Saskatchewan, and Alejandro Argumedo from the Swift Foundation and the International Network of Mountain Indigenous People, along with many other hats that Alejandro wears. Today's event is the inaugural panel in our faculty's annual research seminar series. And we're pleased and we're honored to be partnering with Seed Change this year to bring you a series which we've entitled Food Sovereignty Now, which is inspired by the global peasant movement La Via Campesina's rallying cry. So we have 4 webinars that are planned over the coming months that are going to showcase the work of Indigenous, small farmer, and peasant movements across Turtle Island and the Global South, exploring various themes related to food and to seed sovereignty, and featuring movement leaders working to strengthen traditional and ecological food systems and to defend women, Indigenous people, and farmers' rights in the face of land grabbing, restrictive intellectual property rights regimes, and policies that are designed to support the expansion of corporate agribusiness. So we have panels that are coming up that are exploring seed laws, intellectual property regimes, and farmers' rights. We have another exploring regional perspectives on agroecology and considering agroecology as both a movement and a practice, and feminist agroecologies. And so we'll be sending you news about those after today's event. But we wanted to open the series by centering Indigenous perspectives, which is the focus of today's conversation. And we're very grateful for support from York's Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, as well as York's Indigenous Teaching and Learning Fund to help us to do that. And I also want to thank the Master's Program in Conference Interpreting at York's Glendon College, and especially Aurélien Mueller and Natalia Fedorenkova for support in getting the simultaneous interpretation on the go. So we actually have interpretation available in various languages, in French, in Spanish, in Russian, and in Cantonese. So you can look down at the bottom of your screen and there's a button there, interpretation, and you can select the language if you'd like to take advantage of that. Donc, il y a un bouton en bas de votre écran, interprétation, if you'd like to have simultaneous translation. I also want to thank Igor Lute and a whole team of technical support in our faculty for getting the webinar technology set up for today as well. So I'm going to pass the mic in a minute to my colleague, Sean Hillier, who's the interim director at the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, to say a few words of welcome, and then over to Beatrice from Seed Change, who's going to introduce our speakers. But before I do that, we wanted to begin by acknowledging the land and the Indigenous stewards of the land. Where I am here in Toronto, York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. And so the area known today as Toronto or Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and it's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. So we'd like to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we also want to acknowledge that this territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, the Kaswenta or the Two-Row Wampum, the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, the so-called Toronto Purchase, among other treaty agreements. Indigenous nations entered into treaty with the Crown on the understanding that their title and their jurisdiction over their lands would be respected, and that British, what later became Canadian, presence here would be for mutual benefit. To say that the Crown and settler society have violated those promises would be a gross understatement. But one of the small parts of the task of confronting ongoing settler colonialism is centering Indigenous knowledges and epistemologies and uplifting the work of Indigenous peoples, which is what we hope our webinar today contributes to. So I'm really grateful to all of you for joining us. It's always exciting to know who's in the room and where you are joining us from. So maybe while Sean and Beatrice are welcoming us, it would be great if people could just use the chat to say hello and to tell us where you're joining us from, because I think word about today's event has gotten out quite widely. So Sean, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that grounding and intro, Martha. Kwe, Ani, Tenzi, hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Hillier. I'm a Mi'kmaq scholar registered with the Halapu First Nation and associate professor and York Research Chair in Indigenous Health Policy. I serve as the interim director for the Center of Indigenous Knowledges and Languages. We are an interdisciplinary research center here at York University that supports Indigenous knowledges and languages, along with advancing decolonizing scholarship across disciplinary fields at York and beyond. This talk for us is very timely as York researchers work with our community partners in launching a traditional food and medicine garden right here on our Kiel campus this coming spring. Cycle is very pleased to be co-hosting this event, and we very much look forward to hearing from our speakers today. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Beatrice from Seed Change to provide her opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So happy to be here, and thank you for being here, and thank you to our speakers, especially. I'm speaking to, my name is Beatrice Oliver. I work at Seed Change, and I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Indigenous food sovereignty is a decolonial practice and movement grounded in the revitalization of Indigenous peoples' food systems, sacred stewardship responsibilities, and the assertion of their jurisdictions and lawways. In many Indigenous cultures, seeds are ancestors, sacred relatives that have been cared for over millennia, that are a central foundation of Indigenous food systems and sovereignties. In this panel, Indigenous seed keepers, activists, and scholars will discuss the importance of seeds and biodiversity in Indigenous food systems and share their work strengthening Indigenous food sovereignty. So thank you again. This will be a great session and very much looking forward to our first speaker. Martha?
Wonderful. Okay, great.
Apologies. It's my turn still. Yes, it is. It is a real pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker. Kahehtoktha Janice Brant is a Ganyan Gehaga from Tinandinaga, Mohawk Territory, Ontario, Canada. She sits with the Bear Clan and carries on her family heritage as a dedicated farmer. She is a scholar, educator, author, and artist of Haudenosaunee language and culture. An actionist for sacred ecology and seed conservation, Janice helped to found Redinayahentus, They Are Farmers of the Seed, and the Gundege Seed Sanctuary and Learning Center, host to a living seed collection. Janice, thank you so much. Please.
Sego Zewaguego. Thank you for that introduction. It's nice to meet you and see you here today. So I guess I'd just like to start with a greeting that's a customary in Kahehtoktha culture and traditions. So we like to have a greeting to everyone that they're, I guess, safe and happy and peaceful, and so glad that you could join today, and just so appreciate it very much that you would come on to hear us share from our experiences. So I guess the first slide shows, oh sorry, could we possibly go to the next one? So my name is Kahehtoktha. That's my Ganyokahaga name, and it's something that I really carry with great honor. And so my name means she goes the length of the garden. And so if you're a gardener and you can envision some plants in your garden, think of the ones that, stretch their vines long ways. And so some of you may be able to guess what plant that name might be referring to. But another person who I, have been learning the language from a few years ago, his name was Degahonwazure, and he also explained to me that it also meant that she makes a great effort. And so I feel like that sort of inspired me in my life to make a good effort here in my time that I have on the earth. And so these two images just show a little bit about my community. So, and tell you a little bit about my background and where I'm speaking from today in Kenhte. So, one, I was raised being involved in the Mohawk Agricultural Society, and a lot of the community when I was younger still had quite a bit of farming and also gardening practices or small scale farming that looked after their families or immediate families. And so we have a long history that goes way beyond the Mohawk Agricultural Society, which is just over about 120 years old or just around that area. And then so our agricultural history goes so much further than that, right back to the Mohawk Valley and even beyond that. So I just wanted to share these images, a little bit about where I'm coming from as a Mohawk woman, gardener, farmer, and person that really has been interested in seeds for most of my life. People that know me well probably will say I was even a child, and even then I knew what my gift was, or my gifts. So this other image is the logo of the Kenhte Seed Sanctuary and Learning Center, which was established in 2018. And so we're still strengthening our foundation, but we're doing really important work, which I'm going to share more about in a few minutes. We can go to the next slide. I want to be really mindful of my time, and I forgot to set my clock, so I'm really sorry. Is there someone that could possibly...
I got you, Janice.
Thank you very much. So all seeds have a story, and my seed story started, like I said, when I was a young girl, and it was really fostered in so many different ways through our culture. And so beginning was our creation story, and without getting into that description in detail and telling that story, there's a part where it talks about the seeds that she brought with her from Sky World and how those seeds were planted here on Earth. And so the connection that the Ungwehule, that the Ganyoke Haga, that the Haudenosaunee have with seeds goes back to our very beginning, and so much so that it's not just the creation of here on Earth, but how we're connected to the sky world above. And so that worldview is a complete way of seeing the world, and it impacts us and how we operate here on Turtle Island. And so I hope that you enjoy this painting. Is a painting that I did back in 2015. And I, like showing it because it shows this different worldview. And so we're also given these instructions as Ungwehule, as Haudenosaunee, that every day we express our gratitude and thanksgiving. And that's a little bit what I tried to do back a couple of slides when I first started, to greet you and to welcome you. And that's the way we greet all the parts of creation and all the different aspects of the world. And the reason the Haudenosaunee do that is because we recognize that the deep interconnection that we have with all of creation and the significant influence that has had on us, but also on the earth. And that imagine that we could have lived here for thousands of years without, causing the degradation that has happened in the last 500. So that just goes to show these are very meaningful practices, and it's very important for us to know and understand our seed relationship going back as far as we can. So the next part of who we are as Haudenosaunee, I feel that really gives us like strength and health is to honor our cycle of ceremonies, because the cycle of ceremonies is a lunar cycle that is a whole year-long process. And sometimes when I'm talking about the seed sanctuary or just seed work in particular, you know, I feel like a lot of people have a set time in their mind of when that might happen, and they relate it particularly to gardening, without recognizing that the seed cycle and that the work of the seed keepers is a year-long process. And for us, we're just getting ready to celebrate the midwinters, and we know it's that time, you know, because of the constellations that we see right now, and we know it's time because it's the midwinters, so we need to be uplifted and reinvigorated and to reignite our fires and to stir the ashes of life and to get us really thinking again about what happens when the earth starts to thaw and the worm moon comes and everything warms up again. And so it's this pattern of life, and these are the foods, the seeds that we keep are a lot the foods that we eat in these ceremonies. And so different ceremonies celebrated like different foods as they came into ripening and being harvested. And then we didn't forget about the seed part. We kept doing the seed part because, you know, we put those seeds, you know, in our ceremonies as well, in all different sorts of ways, songs and dances and the rattles, even right to the rattles that we make. And even some creation teachings that I've heard, like, you know, said that the world began with the sound, and some indigenous, you know, peoples believe, including myself, that maybe that sound was that great gourd rattle or that shaker that resonated out into the universe, and that we respond, and that there was some, you know, response echo back, and therefore, like, you know, this great marvelous creation, you know, began, and that I'm really grateful to be a part of. And it's pretty amazing. So we can do the next slide, but that's like where I came from. That is the perspective I'm sharing from today. Like as a young girl, I just remember loving how much the creation story meant to me, to hear about Sky Woman, to hear about her love of the seeds and how she carried them and how she planted them and sang to them, and she gave to them. So they had, and they gave to her. And so that was a reciprocal relationship. And that's something that when I think of those words like seed sovereignty or food sovereignty and seed and food sovereignty, I think of, you know, I think a bit about that. I think about reciprocity, and that's probably one of, you know, the qualities that, you know, we could think about when we're having that discussion. But there's a lot of historic impacts, you know, to seed preservation in our communities, in our societies as Indigenous people, because of colonization and all of the different ways that our food system was attacked and changed. And, you know, and so these quotes that you see here, one is from Dr. Theodore Jojobo. He's at the University of New Mexico. And after a small exchange, he shared a blog with me that I really enjoyed, that talked about community planners and how a lot of the Indigenous work that's been carried on over many generations, you know, each successive generation had to believe in it and buy into it in order to continue it on. And but then, you know, colonization started to, you know, disrupt that, and we were even, you know, military strikes were taken against us, like measures in order to eradicate us, you know, from our homelands. And so if they couldn't control the people, they started to attack the cornfields and the storage of the foods that our people had. Anyway, you can see those, so I'm not going to read them, and we can go to the next slide. Can I just ask if you would maybe let me know, just as maybe like we have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and then
You're doing great. You have until 1:05. You're doing great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So what you see here is a modern day wampum belt. It was built by many hands around a seed rematriation that happened. The ceremony happened in April 2019, but in early 2018, we became candidates to receive seed rematriation from the Sisters of Providence, who had a private seed collection. And the collection was local to the area and had a lot of our seeds in it. And so we wanted to let the sisters know that we were interested in these seeds and that we were concerned about their well-being. And so in the process of meeting them and exchanging with them, one of the things that they had noticed about us immediately was that our connection to the seeds was not driven by economics. It was driven by our spiritual connection and our history with these seeds, and also our sense of dedication and responsibility to make sure that the next generations have access to these seeds, and that they'll also be able to enjoy them in their life and in their ceremonies. And so this seed rematriation was something that our community was consulted on and took very seriously. And so much so that we wanted to make a record in our own custom, in our own tradition. And so therefore we used the wampum belt, and we also consulted on the Haudenosaunee visual code that is present in our imagery, so that we made sure that long into the future that this belt, when it was held, it would be able to be read, and people will recite the story of these seeds being returned to our community, but also that the seeds are passed from generation to generation, as you see with the representation of the two human-like figures. And they're white because they represent love and light and purity. And that those are some of the qualities that you look for people to care for the foods and the seeds. And so in the middle of this belt, you see from the line of the seeds being passed, some seeds are dropping down into a mound, and that symbolizes the seeds being planted. And so it's not that we're just passing seeds. We are passing the wisdom of the seeds, the knowledge of how to care for them, the skills of being a gardener, but also new skills, the skills of weaving the wampum and knowing that this is our culture and our tradition, and it's alive today, and it can effectively record our stories and make records of the things that are really important and valuable to us. And I think also it's a symbol of truth and reconciliation, and the fact that we have a lot of work to do ahead of us still, to strengthen our connection again to the land and our spirituality, and then also to be able to stand in our own light and be able to make right relations with other peoples. So this belt really means a lot to me, and it symbolizes a lot. And the hands that are holding it mean a lot to me as well, because these are the youth in our community in Tyendinaga, Bantege. So it's really very powerful and very special. We can go to the next slide. So a lot of the work that I was introduced to and have been working on just, leading up to the Kenhte Scene Sanctuary and helping to found Radina Hiantos, is that we started to recognize and wake up to this a long time ago, because I've read a lot of great information from the 70s and 80s and 90s about how our people wanted to ensure that our agricultural practices were being passed down to the next generations. And it seemed like widespread across Turtle Island, this phenomena, and care of our seeds. And so even ourselves amongst the Haudenosaunee, we want to make sure that we're teaching seed to seed practices, so that there's always a seed in the future, that there's this, and my friend Dr. Jojobo, pointed out to me that seed keepers are a community planner. And I really appreciated like him pointing that out to me. And it was something that he learned from listening to my story. And so I'm really grateful for these very special exchanges that happen between different Indigenous peoples. And we have different little perspectives on things, but it also helps us all grow and to unify, ourselves. So yeah, so these lovely photos just help to, show like what we're talking about when we're thinking about seed to seed. We can go to the next slide. So at Kenhte Seed Sanctuary and Learning Center, we have currently a gardener. She's a professional gardener and trained in sustainable practices, which is something that we really is very much a priority to us in the seed conservation work, because we want to have the idea that our people left it better than it was, rather than leaving it, stripped away to nothing. And so our main priority at Kenhte Seed Sanctuary is seed saving education. And so we have 2 interns right now currently that are actively learning the seed collection and how to grow it. And of course, it takes a lot of time. And so we estimate about 5 years to really become quite fluent in growing out this particular seed collection of 300 vegetable, herbs, and flowers with many Indigenous varieties. And we also have plans, because we do know there is a need for seed conservation work of our Indigenous seeds, and to help to foster their preservation and hopefully rematriate them so they become more available to everyone. It takes a lot of work, and we hope, that we will have more interns as we establish, our foundation for the seed sanctuary. But our priority: seed saving education, seed conservation and protection, and the rematriation of seeds to help get them back out there where they need to be and where they can be grown and again distributed again, so that we're always increasing the amount of seed. But something special we do at Kenhte is, we emphasize to people that we're a regionally adapted collection. So it's really about climate adaptation. So the seeds are not housed far away in a seed bank or set aside somewhere. Rather, we're having that relationship with them that our ancestors had, and we're growing them out year after year and saving the seeds and learning about each of the varieties and reintegrating those varieties back into our diet as the seeds and fruits become more available to us. But in the current stage that we're at with Kenhte Seed Sanctuary, the seed is our priority, and any foods that happen as a result are sort of a byproduct of our work, and we're able to distribute those and give those to the community through the food bank. So yeah, and so a lot of what we do where we are at Kenhte Seed Sanctuary, is try to help people reconnect their relationship to the land through understanding the seed work and participating in the work bees, which are part of the gardening activities, and all the different skills and knowledge that our people had and used and applied in order to grow these foods and to help them, reproduce their seeds. So we can go to the next slide. I do want to say I love those little hands inside that squash getting those seeds. I can always look at that. I never get tired of seeing that. I always feel like children are really good seed keepers. When they're introduced to it early in their life, they immediately connect with the magic of it and the magic and mystery of life. And therefore they, become great gardeners and activists for the seeds. And so that is a very special photo. Little girl came up and just started cleaning the seeds out of that squash at a display table we had, and it was just so wonderful. So I guess the last thing I did want to say pertaining to that slide was about Haudenosaunee cosmology and how how we reconnect to the land is so important, and how we connect to the land also helps us to connect with cosmology and the stars and that whole relationship that we have. And so this last slide, I always feel like I can't talk about seed sovereignty or food sovereignty without having a conversation about health and environment. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago. My friend Rick Hill was in it, and he said something to the effect of, are we going to fight over that last polluted fish? And I just, and I thought, and this is why I cannot have a conversation about seed and food sovereignty without thinking about health and environment. And so these are the things that I feel, these 4 little points here are important to me. And I just want to add, with them, as I kind of wrap up my sharing, and I hope it's been helpful and useful. I could talk a lot about the seed sanctuary, but when we are healthy, like we were so many years ago, like off and on, like I've, as I study history and the changes over time, it's very hard to control a people that are healthy and that have a lot of good food. It's really hard to manipulate people that have a clear mind and a clear heart. And when you really have a sense of sovereignty, it's hard to be influenced when you can stand in that place. And trust me, I think, like, from our teachings that I've had through my whole life as a Kenhte, it's not a place we stand alone. It's a place we stand when we're unified with other people that have a good mind and that have the great peace. And so that's the kind of, strength that I want to have in my life and that I'm trying to aspire to. And that's what helps me find the energy and to work on seed projects and to keep speaking and sharing. So I want to say Tokniko, that's the words I have right now. And so thank you very much, Noah.
Nyawegoa, Janice, thank you so much for that. It's so exciting and inspiring to hear about this powerful work of rematriation and of resurgence in your community. And Nyawegoa, thank you for giving us a better understanding of, these reciprocal relationships with seeds that you're talking about that are embedded in the Haudenosaunee worldview and cycle of ceremony and land-based practices and cultural practices that have been so, violently and intentionally disrupted by settler colonialism. And it's really exciting to see and learn about this work of strengthening and bringing this back. And it's also interesting that you were mentioning Dr. Theodore Hohola, because he's actually giving a talk in the faculty tonight. He's visiting us for the next 2 weeks. So maybe we can also, I'll figure out how to post some information about that in the chat for those of you who are in Takaranto who want to come this evening. He's going to be speaking about some of the work that you're referencing. I just want to say to everyone that we're really excited for your questions, but to ask you to please hold them. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from Priscilla and then from Alejandro, and then we're going to open things up to discussion between our panelists and for questions from our audience. And also thank you for chiming in to let us know where you're joining us from. We have a lot of people from across so-called Canada, but we also have folks who are joining us from Ghana and from Thailand and from Ecuador. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. Our next speaker is Priscilla Settee, who is an activist for Native rights, women's rights, and environmental rights living in Canada. She's a professor emeritus of Indigenous Studies and acting Vice Dean Indigenous in the College of Arts and Science at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And her research interests include Indigenous knowledge systems, biodiversity protection, Indigenous food and politics, the impacts of globalization on Indigenous peoples and on Indigenous women's rights and food sovereignty. So, you know, a conversation about this would not be complete without Priscilla. And so we're just really so grateful that you're here to share with us.
Thank you. I'm going to start my talk with listing a number of the challenges that First Nations and Métis people, Indigenous people face today. As we know, it's a big challenge, and we are not alone in Canada with the challenges. And I know that a number of people on the program, on this webinar, are working alongside us, be they Indigenous or not. So that I want to acknowledge that. So here in Saskatchewan, hunger remains a challenge for our citizens. For example, 1 out of 3 children are reported to be hungry, going to bed hungry, and many of that 1 in 3 are Indigenous children. So we know that hunger has a lot to do with poverty and neoliberal policies that continue to break down social support systems, particularly for the margins, for the people living in the margins. So, and it's impacting more and more people. I think it's safe to say that in Saskatchewan, we are seeing the price of food just skyrocket, and it's really creating hardships for not only people in the margins, but more of the people, you know, just across the board. So these are certainly issues that we are aware of, and they are also solutions that have led to many community-based solutions. So I'm going to start with describing the challenges, but then end up my talk on solutions. So my frame of reference as an activist scholar is coupled with a long history of working on community-based food security. Personally, my father, my mother were first-generation urban dwellers who were forced to come to the city because my father served in one of the world wars and he was deemed civilized. So he was deemed to have his Indian status removed. So our whole family was uprooted from our traditional lands and moved into the city. So these actions continue to pose a lot of challenges for reserve-based people. My frame of reference as an activist scholar includes looking at the challenges within a wider framework. So a topic like seed sovereignty is part of a continuum of challenges for what we know in Canada are diverse Indigenous peoples with diverse food sources. So seed sovereignty, while it's a very important issue, is not the only issue that impacts our people's ability to feed themselves. And I'm talking here of land-based people that rely on large animals, wild berries, wild plants, water, good fresh sources of water. That is increasingly all of these foods and cultural things are being eroded daily. And the battles that we're having for seed sovereignty, food sovereignty, are ones that are waged at many levels, including the United Nations. So, for example, a number of us were just at the Conference of Party meetings with the heads of state in Egypt for the meeting which focused on climate change. And there was another meeting in Montreal at Conference of Party 17. And I presented there about the impact of climate change on our foods. And several years ago, while serving as a David Suzuki Fellow, I produced a paper based on a research paper based on interviews with trappers from my home community of Cumberland House, Saskatchewan. And that research paper, my fellowship with Suzuki, affirmed what a previous paper that I wrote for the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, that land-based and trapping cultures were really in big trouble. The quality of the food was not the same excellent quality that was had back in my father's and mother's day. And generally, it was becoming very impossible for most trappers to make a living off the land. And, you know, what we are doing to the land, most people are aware, is that, you know, through the Western modes of development, land is only seen as a resource to provide wealth elsewhere. The culture and the knowledge that is of our people on the land is not valued. And I do a lot of work in family violence and disappeared and murdered Indigenous women. And I speak about the metaphor that exists between how we treat land, how the state treats land, and how the state treats Indigenous women. And, you know, it's a good metaphor because it helps us to see what's wrong with a capitalist mode of development, what it does to humanity, what it does to land. So it's safe to say that most of our lands in Canada have been expropriated and used to benefit outside wealth, to benefit outside our own communities. So we have what we described as so-called third world conditions, damaged environments, water systems, citizens with really no human rights or very limited ones. And, you know, these events have been uncovered by the Truth and Reconciliation program that Canada was involved in. So it's like the food system cannot be seen singularly as an isolated challenge. It affects all aspects of our lives, and it continues to be impacted, of course, by the industrial intensification agricultural systems that are dependent on fertilizers and other unnatural products to grow more food, but because of the distribution and control methods, it's not always distributed to the people who need it the most. So there are power and control issues that impact not only seed sovereignty, but, you know, the whole gamut of food systems as experienced by Indigenous peoples and that are at the base of traditional economies that were once very holistic and good for community, good for families, where women were the central feature of food sovereignty. So it's really important to put this discussion of seed sovereignty within this continuum of food insecurity, food security. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my role as a board member on Seed Change Canada. It's a marvelous organization. If people haven't checked it out or are not familiar with it. But basically, some of their principles that they operate from are these: the need to strengthen local food systems, to acknowledge the fact that there is corporate control of seeds by largely 4 companies. And those companies are Bayer, Cortina, Syngenta, and Lima Grain. So these 4 companies control 50% of the global seed market. And this harkens back to a conversation that I had with the traditional elder, Danny, who just passed away. And he recalls a story back in the 40s when agents from Indian Affairs came out to his community with their seeds that they wanted the people of that First Nations community to utilize, and to give them all of their traditional corn seeds. And Danny said that his mother hid all their traditional seeds in the inside framework of the house. So they weren't able to get to the traditional seeds. So this business of imposing sometimes genetically modified seeds, hybrid seeds, seeds that are involved in intellectual property theft from Indigenous peoples, and seeds that are impacted by the process of international trade agreements that Canada is very much a part of, and that has a central voice in the Conference of Party talks that recently took place in Egypt and Montreal. So within that framework of corporate domination of seeds is really also the parallel act of usurping our lands and really destroying the lands through mining, clear cuts. Now the latest in our province is the theft of peat moss to produce lovely lawns for southern communities. And this is something that is happening globally in the north of our province. We are networking with other communities that are being impacted by peat moss extraction. And if anybody knows much about peat moss, it's that it takes, thousands of years to produce a peat moss field, which is home to the foodstuffs for moose and caribou and a lot of the 4-legged animals that we have relied on for sustenance in the past. But with the mining of peat moss, the animals will surely starve. And through my research with the David Suzuki Foundation, I noted that in conversation with the trappers, that it was no longer possible to work as guides or to even live off the land solely through traditional diets. So the protection of land has to be a central feature of the fight for food sovereignty. And to the point that, food sovereignty work is solidaritist work. And I know a number of people that are on this call that are working with us, both academically and in the fields. So Seed Change Canada, back to Seed Change Canada, is a global movement of farmers fighting for justice, health, and sustainability to reclaim the power of food. I always say in my teaching that, food has the ability to unite us all, that we all need food. We know that the quality of food is deteriorating, even though we may be producing more foods. And we know that the distribution is a problem, so that, communities are not reaping the benefit of the production of more food. We know that the quality of food is not as good. And so a group like an agency like Seed Change Canada, we work with farmers to grow just, healthy, sustainable harvest everywhere. by keeping seeds in farmers' hands and strengthening farmers' knowledge, we help communities to thrive. So we reinforce farmer-led solutions in much the same way that the National Farmers Union also does. We keep biodiversity alive. We work with farmers to preserve and expand seed diversity. And I'm reminded of a trip that Pratap Shresh from our board, who lives in Nepal, was recently in Guinea-Bissau and another country in Africa to continue this really important project of or action of promoting local seeds. One of the things that struck me as an academic in my years of supervising PhD students in agriculture and food-related studies is the fact that we get international students, we train them, but we never, or they're not encouraged to see the value of some of their traditional crops. They're seen to get training to kind of be lock, stock, and barrel with the company line that many universities promote. So I would always be asking these students, like, what about your millets? What about your local seeds? What about your local foods? Try and focus more of your research and honoring of the local knowledge. So that's a challenge that within academia we face quite a bit with our international students, seeing their knowledge base as a deficit rather than a positive. Finally, Seed Change works to advocate for system change, as do a number of us academics. We have had numerous meetings with, for example, ministers of agriculture. We know that food is not just a singular challenge, but it's backed up by really powerful systems. And that is part of the challenge in what we're doing today here within the framework of seed sovereignty. We also call on public development banks to stop funding agribusiness companies that take land, natural resources, and livelihoods away from local communities. And, you know, this demands a certain level of understanding of how the neoliberal method of global governance impacts all of our communities. Land grabs are something that don't only happen in so-called developing regions, but are happening right here in Saskatchewan. And when the land grabs happen, and I think it's said that there are 11 very powerful, largely white male land grabbers that go into many regions of the world and just take land, maybe in discussion with the government, but oftentimes the people who are living on those lands are sometimes killed and often just swept off the land. So these land grabs are happening in the face of, particularly in Canada, at the same time that our land claims have not been settled. Now, these are land claims that were begun back when Canada was being settled, treaties were signed, and we are still waiting for that. Meanwhile, large tracts of land that were once small farming communities are being sold off to international buyers. So what can you do? Well, we are all treaty people with rights and obligations. And one of the things that we need to focus on, that I certainly am here at the university, is to decolonize the systems. And in terms of climate change, there's a saying that there is no economy on a dead planet. So we know that there's a lot of excellent work being done around climate change, because I think it's really on our doorsteps now, with a lot of the very severe weather systems that are visiting us here in North America and throughout the globe. So I'm going to I still have a few minutes. I want to talk about the role of food justice. and some of those parts that exist within food justice. I learned many powerful lessons from the food justice movement based out of Southern Ontario, which was largely led by advocates for food justice, Canadians and international people. And they put food justice at the center of food production. So for example, the many thousands of imported farmers, farm workers that we have in BC and Southern Ontario primarily, although we do also have them in Saskatchewan, they're brought into Canada with really no citizen rights. For example, many of them are lodged in substandard living conditions. They are brought here without their family. They are brought here without the full citizenship made to produce our food, but yet with very few citizenship rights, such as healthcare. If they are injured on the job, oftentimes they are sent back to the communities. And most Canadians don't know that a lot of that lettuce that appears on our plate was produced by workers with very few human rights. So that's one of the things that food justice puts at the center. In addition to fighting for land access, saving and sharing seeds, adopting agroecological farming techniques, expanding food access, defending workers' rights, ensuring equal opportunity, and champion food education. For many years, I've been teaching Indigenous food sovereignty here on campus, and myself and Dr. Shayla Shukla from the University of Winnipeg produced I think it was the first book on Canadian Indigenous food systems. We are currently working on our second book because the response to the first one, we had many scholars and community-based people wanting to contribute to the book, and we simply had to limit the number of chapters that we had. So we're hoping to have our second book launched in 2023 this year. I'm going to close my discussion with a couple of really interesting, effective approaches to some of the challenges I have identified. One of them is the land back movement. So land back is a movement that existed for generations with a long legacy of organizing and sacrifice to get Indigenous lands back into Indigenous hands. Currently, there are land back battles being fought all across Turtle Island to the north and the south. And I want to mention two in particular, even though there are many, many, many. I want to talk about the case of Berta Cáceres, who was murdered for trying to stop a huge mega dam in her home Lenca community of Honduras. On March 3rd, 2016, Berta Cáceres, age 44, who won the Goldman Environmental Prize for her environmental work, was visited by the military, and she was shot, murdered. And it was later discovered that the people who shot her were trained at the infamous School of the Americas in Georgia in the United States. So this is a case of a human rights violation of an Indigenous person being murdered for protecting the land, which has led to a strengthening of the land back movement. And this is not an anomaly. I think the year after Berta was murdered, 14 of her people from her organization defending land rights were also murdered. And as a young woman back in the 70s, I traveled throughout Latin America. And I was shocked and horrified to learn the extent of the genocide of Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. And it stuck with me for my lifetime. And it still informs the work that I do, both within the academy and in my personal life. For me, back then, in the late 70s, it was it was a moment to realize the global connectedness that we as Indigenous peoples, land peoples, and our allies, how we are linked and what is our responsibility in that regard. So another 2 years ago, I was fortunate to be selected as a fellow with the Indian Collective, which is a US-based, South Dakota-based agency with a lot of power and influence locally. And they have developed a land back campaign demand, well, several demands. And those focus on defunding white supremacy, because whether we want to admit it or not, a lot of these problems have a color code impacting another color code. And we have to dismantle white supremacy structures that forcibly remove us from our lands and continue to keep our people in oppression. So one of the ways that we can do that is to defund agencies of white supremacy. And for example, police, military, industrial complex, prisons, criminal justice systems, and other places. And Indian Collective is doing exactly that. We need to also decriminalize the actions of our people for speaking out about land rights, to be very vocal about events like the loss of Berta Cassierra's life and many others. And also the criminalization of our own people in Canada for standing up to mega developments that injure the land and oppress our peoples. Another agency that is working to improve the world is Grassroots Global Alliance, that I've had the good fortune of working with. And their theme is how to work. And their theme is fight the bad, change the rules, move the money, build the stronger we, build the new, and change the story. And how do we do that? Well, we do that through energy democracy, recognizing that almost our entire food system, industrial food system, is so dependent on energy, non-renewable energy. We do that through actions like today's webinar on food sovereignty. And we reinvest in our power, our human power. And I want to close my talk with two quotes. The first one is by Dr. Rupa Fish, and she states that all ancestries rising, no one left out of the circle. This is what the oldest redwood on the peninsula told me. It is time to gather all in the circle to build another way. The changes are coming hard and fast now. It is time to gather to create the resilient systems that will carry us through. We can't vaccinate our way out of this. And the first time I wrote that quote down, we were just in the midst of COVID, recognizing how vulnerable we are and all of those challenges that the COVID sickness put upon us. And I'm going to close my presentation with another quote from Chico Mendes. Chico Mendes was a Brazilian indigenous rubber tapper. And he was killed, again, like Berta Cassierras, for defending the forest. And he said, "At first, I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. Now I realize I am fighting for humanity." And I think that is a powerful statement, that in this fight for food sovereignty, we are all linked but by our fight for justice, that we build off the of the good work that Seed Change Canada, is doing, and many of you on this call. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to stick around for questions after Alejandro does his talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Priscilla. You've given us so much to think about and to chew on and to consider. I think it's, really important what you're saying, that we need to think about seed sovereignty in the larger context of Indigenous food systems that are very diverse, some of which are agricultural based, some of which are not, and to remind us about the challenges that are involved in this work, and thinking about food systems and food sovereignty as connected with climate change, as connected with dismantling white supremacy, thinking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and our relationships to the land, and how, the capitalist industrial food system has a relationship with land that metaphorically and tangibly echoes the challenges facing murdered and missing Indigenous women. The staggering corporate concentration of ownership and control in the seed industry and other nodes of the food system, and for reminding us to think about this and to consider this in an international context, in an international lens, which is a great segue to move into a conversation with Alejandro, but also reminding us that we all have responsibilities in this work, that this is the work of food sovereignty is a work of solidarity. So I'm really excited to be in a space with, I'm looking in the chat and I'm seeing so many people from the movement whose names I recognize, and really excited to start our conversation after we hear from Alejandro. But I'm also really excited to hear from Alejandro. So I'll pass the mic to him next after I introduce him. So Alejandro Argumedo is the Director of Programs and Andean Amazon Lead of the SWIFT Foundation. He's a recognized Indigenous Quechua leader and current member of the Board of Directors of Asociación Andes of Cusco, Peru, and of Seed Change, Ottawa, Canada. He's also the advisor to the Potato Park of Cusco, Peru, and the current coordinator of the International Network of Mountain Indigenous Peoples and champion of the global initiative Food Forever. Alejandro is an agronomist by training and has served on various expert panels for the UN and other relevant bodies, and has consulted for national and international organizations. So Alejandro, we're just so honored that you took the time to join us. I hear that you're traveling through the Amazon right now, so thank you so much for being here, and I pass the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining this important conversation. I'm a proud Quechua Indigenous person from southern Peru. I'm based in Cusco, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the Americas. Since it was founded, people still live there. So, I invite you to go and walk those millenary streets and places. I grew up in the farm, though, in a potato farm, and I learned Spanish late in my childhood. So I really appreciate what Janice presented, because it took me back into these early years when I grew up with my grandmother, and understood and learned how you actually communicate with the mountain gods through the potato, and how the spirit of the wind also it's nurtured by the potato, and how we can see our past, understand our present, and foresee our future to the potato. In the past, we had potato gods. Our histories are connected to the origin of crops, just like in the case of Janice that have related. And the history, our history, of course, is the beginning of time when it takes us back deep into the land where the seed is at the center of all this creation. And that, I think, underlines this fact that without seed sovereignty, particularly indigenous seed sovereignty, there is no food sovereignty. So concepts and words matter. And the issue of indigenous food sovereignty continues to be something somewhat abstract, in my view. As you know, we hear at the beginning, it's usually reference to Via Campesina, which is a non-indigenous organization, very important, valuable in terms of the work, but nothing to do with the spiritual content, the land rights, or the association to these spiritual values to the land and how the land nurtures people and all our relations. I highlighted that I've been very fortunate to work with 6 indigenous communities in Peru over more than 15 years, establishing a territoriality that is based on all ways of managing the land, where this concept of seed and how seed nurtures life is at the center of it. It's the potato parks, 6 Quechua communities managing around 10,000 hectares with a population of around 7,000 people, but have established an area-based conservation area that mimics the old land management system that we call IU. There, people protect around 1,470 varieties of native potatoes, and plus the 5 species of wild relatives, along different whole diversity of crops, Andean crops particularly. And in the early 2000s, we went to the International Potato Center and asked the potatoes that were collected back in the 70s so that they can devolve it and we could rematriate to the land. So that was one of the first actions that we made, so that the sovereignty of those seeds would come back to the land. With that diversity, we created a local economy based on economic self-determination, tools of management, which are based on the cosmology and the customary laws of people. So we have our protocols of access and benefit sharing that are based on that. We have different management tools at a landscape level that are based on the old rules about the ecosystem that we still manage, and have helped to maintain the values that underpin the diversity and the association that we have with seeds and our food system. Values of reciprocity, relationality, and solidarity. And those are the goals of the Potato Park. So I'm gonna just underline from that experience 7 key points that I believe underpin indigenous food seed sovereignty from this perspective. And this perspective, I believe, is not just from the Cusco region, but also it's important for Amazonian and Andean peoples in the region. And the first one has to do also with our history. And I think it's important to remember that the seeds we're talking about make the crop species and varieties that are vital for what is called indigenous food sovereignty, or food sovereignty, as Via Campesina explained. Which are so important not just for local food security and livelihoods, but more so to strengthen community social cohesion, to maintain those cultural and spiritual values, and create resilient systems against the very fast, changing conditions of the climate, which is basically in the mountain ecosystem like the Andes, a chaotic system. And we have to remember that while this crop diversity has been maintained, or this seed diversity has been maintained in areas like the Potato Park and other indigenous regions, where most of the crops have originated, have evolved and co-evolved with indigenous peoples, and like the scientists said, domesticated and diversified. So the majority of those crops upon which the food sovereignty of the world depend come from indigenous land, be it in the Americas, or be it in Africa, or be it in Asia. It's indigenous peoples who were the first farmers, who created that diversity, learned how to live with those beautiful beings that became, as we call it, our relatives. We call it Uyuan, the ones that take care of us, so we have take care of them. While you see, as Priscilla had noted, in modern systems, significant portion of this crop diversity have been lost. In all these indigenous, non-indigenous farms, basically due to corporate greed and white supremacist science. And that those forces continue to increase seed vulnerability and erosion. So recognizing that indigenous peoples keep maintaining this large diversity of seeds and food crops in the world, in their lands, which are being attacked most of the time by extractive industries, by land invasions, by different types of forces, tourism, mining, oil extraction. The need here is that we have to begin recognizing that indigenous peoples are the first farmers. Indigenous peoples have developed those crops in those areas and keep maintaining the genetic makeup that underlines the future of agriculture of the world. The second point is that, as Priscilla had mentioned, indigenous people have a rich body of knowledge and practices about seed systems and, of course, food systems, but those are under threat. Even though we contribute largely to the food security of the world, the rights of indigenous people over their knowledge and practices have so far not been recognized. They are being monetized, so that discussion at the international level is focusing on how to provide benefits, how to pay for it, rather than strengthening the social fabric that underpins the continuation of that knowledge. The basic being that indigenous peoples without land, indigenous peoples that are uprooted from the land, lose that connection to the crop, to the seed, and to all the spirituality that underpins our food systems and the different ways we do gastronomy, the different ways we use it for medicine, for rituals, and for social connections. The third point I want to make is that the support for indigenous food systems, which is the next level in terms of this link between indigenous seed systems and food systems, is very weak and inappropriate for seed survival. And while there is an increase in support, an increasing support for small-scale farmers, which, if you start thinking about what does it mean, so we get hung up in these cliches and lingo that FAO, which is basically, a pro-corporate and a colonial institution in the UN, promotes this type of terminologies as a way to extinguish the oldest systems in the world that still are operating and producing this diversity. There is very little support out there, be it in research, be it in in the philanthropic community, worse among government institutions of indigenous food systems. If there is support for indigenous food systems, it will be to link them to the market. And then that means that the spiritual and cultural values that underpin that relation to the land and to the respect for the beings that are the seeds are lost. The fourth point I would like to make is that the tools of managing seed systems need to be based in the customary laws and institutions of indigenous peoples, who are the oldest farmers, therefore have rules and regulations that are as old as time regarding how to use, how to access, use, and distribute benefits that are associated to these genetic resources that now face threat for this, body of law and policy that exists international that is becoming more restrictive in terms of, the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, small farmers, and only protect commercial plant breeders. We're talking about UPOP. We are talking about intellectual property rights or new technologies like you could mention not just like a transgenics, but a CRISPR, Cas9, and other types of technologies that are being pushed there as a solutions. The next point I would like to make is that the continued access to plant genetic resources from indigenous territories requires the recognition of this type of sovereignty at a local level. So that we need policies, not just at an international or national level, but indigenous peoples need to develop their own protocols that regulate these types of transactions so that the benefits that come into the community are distributed according to our own perceptions of justice, to our own perceptions of how these benefits will also benefit all our relations. So this recognition of customary laws should be one of the priorities of the development of the indigenous seed sovereignty. The next point is this contradiction or rather dichotomy between the ex situ conservation system and the in situ conservation system. While there's billions of dollars going to gene banks like the CG system that, it was implemented back in the 40s or 50s through Rockefeller Foundation in many of the centers of origin of crop. In Peru, we have the International Potato Center. Mexico is the CIMIT, which looks into maize because of the center of origin. IRRI, which looks into rice, ICARDA, pulses, and so on and so forth. All that was collected and transferred, to American companies and kept in those ex situ collections, which use huge energy and huge personnel, with the mantra that they will be preserving it for the whole humanity, when we know that 99% of the benefits have gone to the industry. While the in situ, which means the community is keeping without a cent, the largest diversity of crop continues to be neglected. And appreciate the work that Sea Change does, because Sea Change focuses on the systems and processes that help local farmers, indigenous peoples to keep the diversity of their crops locally. So we need a new, more coherent strategy. One, while recognizing that both systems are important, we have to also recognize that both systems has to be funded, has to be supported in the same measure, and shouldn't be this dichotomy. We need some trans situ type of system upon which we can circle the ex situ system with the in situ system. And if communities can have their own seed banks where they can store, the system is more localized. The international system can do that. They already do that, but they should pass some of the power, some of the funds they have to local communities so that the seed sovereignty at the local level can be exercised. The next point I want to make is one that is very critical for me, which has to deal with research and how research in seeds need to be, in terms of epistemic, in terms of its methods, in terms of the tools that they use and the process at the local level need to be changed. While climate change is a big issue right now, and we are looking at that, looking at least in the mountains of Peru, how crops are moving fast, towards the top of the mountain. Right now, in the potato park, potatoes grow basically at 4,500 meters. Planes in Canada, I think, fly at 3,000. So you can imagine where potatoes are moving, and we are almost at the top of the mountain. We cannot farm on the clouds, obviously. So there is a big challenge there. And while that research is important, there's also need to recognize that the knowledge and practice of indigenous peoples are as important as science. And you can imagine how the Green Revolution started, how, in the 40s, scientist that was sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to Peru, came with the idea of, improving the agricultural system, but actually to collect all the potato and other crops diversity that existed. By then, the Russians, I think, already had with Vavilov, the Vavilov Center, and had most of the collection in the world. So they want to catch up. And so through this collection, the Green Revolution started. But the collection and the research was, constructed over a racial hierarchy that equated whiteness with superiority, scientific superiority, knowledge superiority, right? And indigenous peoples with backwards, underdeveloped, indigenous knowledge was not useful. So this racial perception guided the Green Revolution and the potato program that the CIP implemented in Peru. So seed sovereignty means also the fight against white supremacy and colonialism in knowledge. That it's a fight also to have an epistemic diversity with the different methods, processes, and tools of research, are equal. So this is my my thinking. To close, I would just like to note that the concept of indigenous food sovereignty continues to be uncoordinated. I don't believe that we have to just depend on the concept that is out there with Via Campesina. It's unbalanced. It doesn't recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. My experience in the potato park is seed sovereignty has to be constructed in a relational base. You need different types of sovereignties to make one seed sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Alejandro, for this amazing presentation and for bringing in such important issues about colonialism and extractive industries, as well as industrial agriculture, the effect on seeds in terms of intellectual property rights on biodiversity is a real key element for all of us. And also talking about the potato park, which is such a unique, beautiful biocultural heritage experience that you've been leading for many years, been such a crucial part of. So we've come to half an hour before the end, and we would like to have a good time for questions and some discussion. So I will invite people now, if you would like to add your questions in the Q&A. There's already a few questions in there that we won't lose. And also, if you want to raise your hand through the little function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And while that's happening, I will take the opportunity to ask an opening question. I wanted to ask the speakers about the Convention on Biological Diversity that just ended, that just happened in December. And there was an important presence of Indigenous peoples from various parts of the world. I wanted to ask you, what does that process mean for Indigenous seed sovereignty and biodiversity? So I know Priscilla was at the convention. Perhaps, Priscilla, could I ask you first?
Well, I mean, in terms of the history of participation by Indigenous peoples, it was a place where people organized, fought to be present, and always fought to have the voices heard, because they recognized that this was a place where a lot of the decisions were being made, whether development into the next centuries would be sustainable or not. So I remember the first one with a significant presence in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And the thing that struck people there was a lack of benefit sharing of development of the state and free and prior informed consent to even talk about development, like who approves of it, on whose terms. So that was a really big one. But recognizing that, you know, the model of governance that the world has set out through its many international banking systems and the rules of international trade are set in places with powerful heads of states, often led by corporations that dominate the processes and the outcomes. So Indigenous people, in my experience, were always the ones that didn't have the lawyers, could never have the mic to speak. And I was part of that process at a couple of those meetings. And really, they had all the power and control of discussions. The thing that we were able to do was to talk to empathetic heads of state. And I remember at the time when I was involved, it was Brazil and Portugal that, or Spain maybe, that were the ones that were allowing a voice to Indigenous peoples. But sadly, you know, I went back this last year to Montreal to COP17, and very little has changed. And like, they're asking the head of the oil lobby in the Middle East to chair COP28 in, I think it's Saudi Arabia, where it's going to be held next year. So these venues have always been in the mountains and in the swamps or rock piles that were not accessible by most Indigenous people, were exorbitant to attend in price. And so there was a number of situations working against having our voices heard. And those are problematic. And I think, you know, I haven't seen much change since the day back in 1992 forward, except that there's a few more of us in the room.
Thank you, Priscilla. I don't know if Alejandro or Janice.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view in the CBD. I think it's an irrelevant body that's been there for a long time. Irrelevant in terms of seed system, because its agricultural program of work only focuses mostly on non-domesticated species. So you can talk about wild relatives of crops, but not domesticated, that one that we farm. So the CBD and the international treaty and FAO developed what's called the International Treaty on Seeds. You know, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. It has a long name, which is basically pretty much dominated for corporate interest, and where the issues of intellectual property, access to genetic resources, benefit sharing, knowledge management are treated. So the CBD in terms of food is very small, almost irrelevant, as I said. And even in terms of participation, most of these UN treaties became like a corporate tools that promote land grabbing, promote like the privatization of the so-called commons, which are mostly the biocultural heritage of Indigenous people. So I wouldn't give a cent there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a really big topic that perhaps for another moment, because there's some very important questions as well in the question and answers. Martha, would you like me to read these, or I believe some of these, yes?
Yeah, do you wanna maybe field one or two and then I'll take over?
Sure. So Janice, there's a few questions here that are, I'm sure that will be very interesting to look at for you especially. The first one was about what is the belt made of? Perhaps that's an easy one to answer.
Yes, thank you for your question. The belt beads are all made of a shell from the quahog, and so it's all made of shell beads, and shell beads are quite delicate. So they can sometimes break even when you're making the belt. So you have to usually have a few extras. But the reason they use this type of shell bead, historically, the Haudenosaunee have used this shell to make beads and to turn it into wampum belts. So because we were, a lot of youth were involved in building the belt, and community members and other members of other communities that were involved, many hands were on the belt, and we are taught that the shell is porous, and so it has like holes, and it collects up our story that we're telling, and our intentions, and our state of mind as we weave the belt. So using the shell beads is really significant, although they're very expensive today to use those, and so we had to make sure we were able to get them from a person that makes those beads. Yeah. Well.
Thank you so much. Ama?
I just wanted to say quickly that I know that there are some seed keepers and growers perhaps, or organization working on Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous seed keeping. It would be great if you can put your info in the chat, and that will also help with folks who are trying to connect with Indigenous-led seed work, not just across Canada, but also globally as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. The chat is open now, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Martha, would you like to find some more questions from the Q&A?
Sure. There's a series of questions from Saktoya. I'm sorry, I know that I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but I'm going to see whether I can try to enable through the to allow you to ask your question directly to Janice. Let's see if that works. Saktoya Widrick, are you able to speak?
Sego,
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Wonderful.
This works then now. I've worked with the seed industry, that's what I want to call it, from a Haudenosaunee perspective, since I was a child working in my grandfather's gardens, and always had a garden, and always refrained from buying seeds and developing our own. But one of the issues that has always bothered me a little bit is with our Oyengweungwe, our traditional tobacco seeds, that I see that diminish so much that I grow these seeds and I share them with people that want tobacco seeds, but it was never meant for a consumer industry like with cigarettes and tobacco and that type of thing. It was only used to offer a connection to Sonkoyatisu, our creator, before we do everything. And I was just wondering if the seed organizations even attempt to even work with that type of a seed. It's a very, very beautiful seed. And most of our Haudenosaunee people were taught to use that. And I have a seed that I grow that comes from what I've been told by my old uncle, who passed away at 106, that it was thousands of years old, that he had carried it from generation to generation from those that were ahead of him, generations ahead. So it was kind of trying to create a little bit of clarity as to, is it just for food seeds, or are we talking about all seeds together that we work at in these organizations?
Sego, Sagoyeta.
Sego.
Nyawa for coming on, and Nyawa for your question. So at Kenhte Seed Sanctuary, Our collection is primarily vegetables, herbs, and flowers. And of course, one of the seeds that we put in it almost immediately, like because we do add seeds to the collection, that especially seeds that may need seed conservation or protection. And so we do have a couple of tobacco varieties that we're growing at the seed sanctuary. Because they are like in demand. Indigenous peoples, like our peoples, are looking for seeds for sacred tobacco. And so we often get a request for that, which we gladly share that on, because thankfully, in most cases, the tobacco is very, very generous with the seeds. And so we are doing some seed conservation now. I can't say how much work we will do on tobacco per se, because there's so many varieties out there that probably could use some support and help. So if you have a variety that you're growing, that's awesome. And give it a name or some kind of a special label so you know, and when you gift it to people, and that they'll keep that alive and going and sharing it. So Nyawa Segoyeta, I hope that answers a little bit. I'm not sure, I can't speak to other organizations per se. But within Gandege, we try to honor and follow like our customs and traditions. So even when we go to the gardens, like even for a work bee, we do our opening words and we offer tobacco because we recognize that without that, sort of like what Alejandro said, that we'll miss that deep spiritual communication that resonates between the humans and the plants. So yeah. Well.
For that, Janice. There's an interesting question from Priya, who is working with an organization that wants to do work of equity and diversity and inclusion, but is noticing a kind of a disconnect with the process, capacity, and labor that's required of racialized people to create a genuinely safe environment for wider accessibility. So, this is connecting, I think, to, Priscilla and Alejandro were both talking about the need to dismantle white supremacy as part of this sort of movement to build food sovereignty, right? So is there anything that you can suggest to activate this vision, how people do this work at the organizational level? Priya's been suggesting that this organization do team trainings on cultural competency to start, but that really only scratches the surface. There's also a question about supporting farm workers. I'm just, I'm seeing that there's a couple of questions that are thinking about what it means to do this kind of work of solidarity building and what it means to do this kind of work of dismantling white supremacy within food movements.
I just want to comment quickly. This is something that, as the seed collective of Radinahientos, they are farmers of seeds. We discuss these things, and we want to make sure that, that our gardener, is given like respect. That how we look after her, is that we show the utmost respect, like for her skills and her knowledge and her commitment to being the seed mother for us. And then for also sharing and being on hand to teach and do demonstrations with the interns that are coming up behind her. And so we're always asking ourselves, how are we measuring up? Are we giving our own, are we supporting our own seed keepers in the way that we need to? And how do we recognize them? How do we honor them? How do we make sure that they're lifted up in the work that they're doing so that they can continue to do it? And so thank you for that thinking, and thank you for sharing that seed for me to think about it more too. So yeah.
Just quickly, is it possible to have the chat open so that folks can put their information in there? I got a message that they're not able to add to the chat. Thanks. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have another question here for our panelists about you know, there's Crystal Favell, who's from the Cree Métis Nation, who's wondering about how she can save seeds in a traditional way, and if there's an Aboriginal seed swap group that you may know of. So I think, you know, people have been dropping in the chat or putting in the chat different kind of seed organizations and resources that they're connected to and that they're a part of. But, you know, Priscilla and Janice, maybe you can speak a little bit about kind of networks and learning and sharing kind of networks that exist on Turtle Island that people who want to become involved can connect with, or ways of becoming involved in this work.
I did have a slide that I took out of my presentation sort of pertaining to this a little bit. I wanted to say, like, amongst the Haudenosaunee, there are some really well-established seed networks because we are coming from an agricultural tradition. So it goes back a long way. So when I first started, that's the network that I was in, and over time, my network expanded, and I started to meet not just Haudenosaunee seed keepers and gardeners, but more broadly in Ontario, Manitoba, and even in BC. So there is quite a bit of activity. I sometimes like to say we fly below the radar because it seems like, you know, it's already been said, like sometimes we're not even recognized. And as Priscilla said, like, we don't even get the mic. We don't even get to speak. So it's like, I think there's networks out there. Just don't stop looking and try to make connections, because I think that they're there on some level and in different capacities across Turtle Island. And I know on social media, I see lots of interesting groups. And so there's different kinds of seed sharing, although for us here and around the Haudenosaunee, we like to try to work with like regionally adapted seeds, so that we're starting with a seed that's already going to probably be successful in our climate. And so the seeds are really geared toward climate adaptations. So what might work really good here for me in Tyendinaga may not produce the same in BC, or even in, you know, Peru or Ecuador, in a different place. So it's something to consider, but also it's great to like pursue those networks and friendships. And there is, I think through Seed Change, there may be some of those avenues as well. So nyawa.
Great, nyawa for that, Janice. Alejandro, there's a question that I think would be great for you to tackle, which is Rachel Portinga is asking, well, I mean, I think, you know, Priscilla and Janice, you probably have thoughts about this too, but I was thinking about how you were talking about how language matters and concepts matter. And so Rachel is curious to hear your thoughts about the term landrace.
Yeah, those terms like, you know, varieties, landrace, those come from a biological construct that is founded in Western white science. Let's remember that Linnaeus, you know, who created this system of classification, got it from his observation on indigenous taxonomical systems in the Pacific. He was looking into agroforestry systems there. I don't remember the name of the island. And where people have this rich knowledge about, you know, how the different levels, the hierarchy of different species in the forest would be recognized, and he came up with a system. You know, we don't talk much about it, but it became kind of the mantra, the way how you specialize, and by specialization, you kind of, you know, suppress. Science became, you know, the church. So you cannot go against it. So you have to accept it. While in the practice, in indigenous farms, the taxonomy of our crops are still pretty much in our language. In Quechua, we have so many ways of describing the botany of a potato plant, or the maize, or the quinoa, or amaranthus. And each one of those within each species have its, at a varietal level, so to speak, has its own, particularities. So land rights is a colonial term. It's a term that basically, people that think have more knowledge than local people that have created and continue to, domesticate and continue to create diversity cannot name, because they don't have the science, because they don't have that type of knowledge. Well, if you see the taxonomy, and within the taxonomy, the different type of names, the nomenclature of each one of those, nuances of the botany of the plant are well-known, well-established, well-kept, even if it's a oral tradition. And there is quite a bit of work being done by different organizations. I know in the South, to create catalogs, to create databases that uses indigenous taxonomies, so that those types of organization can be kept, so that the language continues to evolve in a technical level. Because, people think that the techniques and the science of it, it's only within the Western realm. No, there's more richness in indigenous science in terms of the taxonomy, because it's not a square. It is very variable. So you may change the name of a species, or the variety according to the season, according to the the habitat where it grows. So there's this complexity that creates that richness in terms of the use of language, and the indigenous concepts that came out of that, that creates like this relationship between the seed, the land, and the ecosystem, are those that I think for seed sovereignty, for food sovereignty, we have to keep using. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Alejandro. I've lost the question in the Q&A. I think it moved up to the chat, and now we just have a flood of incredible people putting their emails in. So we'll see what we can do about gathering these together to create a list. But there was a question, which I think would be a nice one to end on, which was a local chef who was asking what they could do to support the work of Indigenous Seed Sovereignty. So, maybe as a closing question, our panelists could maybe reflect on that in terms of what kind of solidarity and support those of us who are excited to learn about your work and wanting to support it, what people can do. And maybe specifically what chefs can do.
I can go first if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in the potato park, we have a restaurant that specializes in potatoes. It's run by a collective of women. So they have, using the culinary tradition or heritage, have created different types of dishes that come or make this transition from the landscape to the dish, so that those dishes can also express the connection to the land. And each one of those dishes that are related to particular varieties that have very strong spiritual content or cultural and social, local meaning. Like, for instance, we have a potato that's it's used for funeral. So another one that's used for marrying. So making a dish specific for those occasions without potato variety, connecting it with other species that also are ritualistic, but highly nutritious and also that are used in health, is how this indigenous gastronomy that's very old is being practiced there. So my perhaps my point is, we have to go back to that type of model that where you are not disconnected from the land, where the other elements of food are not left out, where it's not just nutrition or health, but also the spiritual values that underpin those. Thank you.
Mhm. Thanks, Alejandro. Janice and Priscilla, do you have any sort of closing thoughts, especially in terms of how people can be supporting this work?
I just, I think from me, I think we just need to recognize that, a lot of the control over our food is in someone else's hands today. And myself, one of the comments that a woman made to me at a gathering, she said, "I always notice your food." And she said it tastes so clean, and I thought, like, my heart, like, it was like the ultimate compliment that I could, have been given, because I put a lot of effort into that food to make sure it is healthy and that it is good. And I think we need to get back involved in our food systems, not just be sort of like on the fringes looking in. We might have to actually, get involved and get our hands dirty and maybe come out and, help in the gardens. And, because people do come to us and they say, we want to do this food and put it in our restaurant, but sometimes it doesn't have enough availability and we need more growers if that were to happen, and so get involved in your food system. If you have seeds, share them. Do a good job seed saving and share those seeds with others, and soon there will be lots, of food available for restaurants and those other things. But
Great. Nyawagoa for that, Janice. I think, we've gone a little bit over time, so I think we're gonna end things there. I am personally really happy that this has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube afterwards so that I can revisit this conversation, because it's been just so rich and there's so much that came out of it. Everyone who registered through Eventbrite, we are going to be emailing you. We'll include a link so you can find this conversation if you want to revisit it or if you want to share it with friends and colleagues. And we'll also send you information about our 3 upcoming webinars over the course of the winter term. I just want to say a huge thank you to Alejandro, to Priscilla, and to Janice for sharing with us today, and to all of you for spending 2 hours with us, and to our translators for translating, and our tech team for making all of this run so smoothly. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, all of you, and we look forward to continued conversations over the coming months.